carriage wheels had barely stopped turning when Duke Alaric Thorne threw open the door of the drawing room and pointed toward the hallway. "Get out of my house tonight," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Take nothing. Leave my estate forever." Duchess Elena stood frozen in the middle of the room, still wearing the pale blue dress she had chosen that morning, because he once told her it suited her. Her hands trembled at her sides. She looked at the papers scattered across the polished table, papers she had never seen before, papers that accused her of stealing funds meant for the tenants of Thornfield. "I did not do this," she said. "Alaric, please, look at me. I have never touched a coin that was not mine." He did not look at her. He looked past her, at the window, at the darkening sky, at anything that was not her face. "The evidence is clear," he said. "My cousin brought me proof, signatures, bank records. I trusted you with everything, and this is how you repaid me." 2 footmen entered the room, summoned by a bell she had not heard him ring. They did not meet her eyes. One of them, an older man named Harold who had served the family for 20 years, hesitated at the door, his jaw tight, as though he wanted to say something and could not. Elena felt the room tilt. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, and for one instant, dizziness swept through her, a strange heaviness she had noticed only twice before in recent weeks, and had dismissed as fatigue from the harvest season's endless preparations. "Alaric," she said again, softer this time, "whatever you believe I have done, give me a chance to prove otherwise. We have been married 3 years. Does that mean nothing to you now?" "It means I was a fool," he said. "Pack a single bag. You leave within the hour." She wanted to scream that this was unjust, that somewhere in this house, a lie had been planted like a seed and had grown into a tree tall enough to block out every memory of kindness between them. But the coldness in his eyes told her that no words would reach him tonight. Grief had already hardened into certainty, and certainty into cruelty. She turned from him and walked up the wide staircase, her hand gripping the banister, each step feeling heavier than the last. In her chamber, she packed only what fit in a single leather bag, a few garments, a small portrait of her late mother, and a single letter Alaric had written her during their courtship, back when his words had been warm instead of frozen. Outside, the carriage that would take her away waited beneath the oak trees, its lanterns glowing weakly against the coming night. Rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then insistent, drumming against the cobblestones of the courtyard. Before she stepped inside the carriage, Elena turned back to look at Thornfield one last time. The great house rose behind her, its windows lit from within, warm and golden, utterly indifferent to the woman it was casting out into the storm. She searched the topmost window, the one belonging to the master bedroom, hoping to see Alaric's silhouette, hoping he might reconsider even now. The curtain did not move. She climbed into the carriage. The driver, a quiet young man named Gareth who had always treated her kindly, avoided her eyes as he shut the door, as if ashamed of the role he had been given. As the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, Elena pressed her palm against her stomach, though she did not yet understand why the gesture felt so important. She only knew a strange, protective instinct had risen inside her, one she could not yet name. Miles away, inside the study of Thornfield, Alaric sat alone at his desk, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. His cousin Reginald Vane stood near the window, arms folded, watching him with an expression that might have passed for sympathy to anyone who did not know him well. "It pains me to see you like this," Reginald said, "but better you learn the truth now than continue trusting someone who was robbing you blind." Alaric said nothing. He stared at the documents on his desk, the ones Reginald had presented that afternoon with such confident detail. Ledgers showing withdrawals in Elena's name, letters supposedly written in her hand describing a scheme to funnel estate funds to a distant relative in the north. Something about the signatures had troubled him at first glance, a slight unevenness in the letters that did not match her usual handwriting. But grief and betrayal had clouded his judgment, and Reginald had been quick to explain it away as evidence of her attempt to disguise her tracks. "She would never do this," Alaric murmured, more to himself than to his cousin. "People surprise us," Reginald said smoothly, "especially when there is fortune involved." Alaric rubbed his temples. The house felt emptier already, the silence pressing in from every corner. He told himself he had done the right thing, that a duke could not be seen protecting a wife accused of theft, that his family's honor required swift and visible justice. But some quiet part of him, buried beneath pride and exhaustion, whispered that he had acted too quickly, that he had not given her the chance to speak before the footmen were called, that he had silenced her the moment she tried. He pushed the thought away and reached for his glass of brandy instead. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows of Thornfield, as if the sky itself disapproved of what had been done that night. The carriage carrying Elena rattled along muddy roads for hours before reaching the edge of a small village called Willowmere, nestled between low hills and a slow-moving river. The driver Gareth had been given strict instructions to leave her at the village inn and return immediately, without lingering, without offering comfort beyond what basic decency required. He helped her down from the carriage, his umbrella barely shielding her from the rain, and pressed a small purse of coins into her hand. "This is my own money, my lady," he whispered. "Not much, but it will help until you find your footing. I am sorry for how this has been done to you." Elena thanked him quietly, too exhausted and heartbroken to argue about accepting charity from a servant who had shown her more decency in that moment than her husband had all evening. The inn was modest, warm despite its plainness, with a fire burning in the common room and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. The innkeeper's wife, a stout, kind-faced woman named Margaret Bell, took one look at Elena's soaked clothing and pale face, and rushed to prepare a room without asking a single question about her circumstances. "You look like you have walked through the worst night of your life," Margaret said, guiding her up a narrow staircase. "Whatever has happened, you are safe here tonight." Elena sat on the edge of a small bed, in a room lit by a single candle, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders, and finally allowed herself to weep. She wept for the marriage she thought she had, for the man she believed had loved her, for the home she would never see again. She wept until exhaustion pulled her into a restless sleep. She dreamed of Thornfield's gardens in summer, of Alaric laughing beside her beneath the apple trees, before pride and suspicion had poisoned everything between them. In the dream, his hand rested gently against her stomach, and he smiled at her with the warmth she remembered from their early days together. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding, the dream already dissolving into fragments. Yet the strange warmth of that dreamed touch lingered against her skin, and once again, she found her own hand resting instinctively over her stomach. A single thought rose clearly in her mind, quiet but unmistakable. Something inside her had changed, something far greater than grief. She rose from the bed as the first gray light touched the window, dressed in her only dry garment, and made her way downstairs to the empty common room. Margaret was already awake, kneading dough at a long wooden table, and looked up with concern etched across her features. "You did not sleep well, my dear," Margaret said. "Come, sit. I will bring you tea." Elena sat by the fire, wrapping her hands around the warm cup Margaret offered. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Elena, surprising herself, asked a question she had never dared ask anyone before. "Margaret," she said carefully, "is there a physician nearby? Someone discreet? Someone who does not know my name?" Margaret studied her closely, understanding dawning slowly across her face, though she said nothing about her suspicions. "There is a widow who lives at the edge of the village," she said instead. "Mrs. Hargrove. She served as a physician's wife for 30 years, and knows more about healing than most doctors twice her age. She keeps her own counsel and asks no questions she is not invited to ask." Elena nodded, gratitude tightening her throat. "Could you take me to her today?" "Of course," Margaret said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Whatever burden you are carrying, my dear, you need not carry it alone." Elena looked down at the cup in her hands, steam rising gently into the cold morning air, and allowed herself, for the first time since the previous night's cruelty, a fragile flicker of hope. Outside the window, the rain had finally stopped, and pale sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds over Willowmere, casting long golden light across the wet cobblestones of the village street. Elena did not yet know what the coming months would demand of her. She did not know that the child growing quietly within her would one day stand as heir to the very estate that had cast her out in disgrace. She knew only that she was no longer entirely alone, and that somewhere inside her, a new and unexpected strength was beginning to take root. She rose from the fire, straightened her shoulders, and followed Margaret out into the brightening morning, ready to face whatever truth awaited her at the widow's door. The path to Mrs. Hargrove's cottage wound along the edge of the river, past fields still wet with the night's rain, silver droplets clinging to every blade of grass. Margaret walked briskly beside Elena, offering quiet reassurance with each step, though Elena's mind raced far ahead of her feet. She thought of Alaric's face in the moment he had ordered her away, cold and closed like a door bolted from the inside. She thought of the documents scattered across his desk, documents she had never seen, accusations built from lies she could not begin to understand. Someone had wanted her gone from Thornfield badly enough to forge her signature, to twist ledgers into weapons, to turn her own husband against her in a single evening. She did not yet suspect Reginald Vane by name, though a small, uneasy feeling stirred in her whenever she recalled his calm, watchful presence at family gatherings, his quiet questions about the estate's finances, his interest in matters that seemed, in hindsight, far too detailed for a mere cousin with no claim to inheritance. The cottage appeared ahead of them, small and tidy, with herbs drying along the windowsills and smoke curling gently from the chimney. Mrs. Hargrove opened the door before they even reached it, as though she had been expecting visitors. "Margaret Bell," she said warmly, then turned her sharp, kind eyes toward Elena. "And a stranger in need of quiet counsel, unless I miss my guess." Elena managed a small, surprised smile, despite the weight pressing on her heart. "You read people well," she said. 30 years married to a physician teaches you to notice what people do not say aloud," Mrs. Hargrove replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "Come in, both of you. The kettle is already warm." Inside, the cottage smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke, comforting in a way that eased some of the tension from Elena's shoulders. Mrs. Hargrove guided her to a chair near the window, while Margaret excused herself to attend to matters back at the inn, promising to return before midday. Once they were alone, Mrs. Hargrove studied Elena for a long moment, her expression neither judgmental nor overly gentle, simply attentive. "Tell me what troubles you," she said. "Not the whole story, unless you wish to share it. Only what concerns your health." Elena hesitated, then spoke carefully, describing the dizziness she had noticed in recent weeks, the sudden waves of nausea in the mornings, the strange tenderness she had dismissed as exhaustion, and finally, the instinctive certainty that had settled over her since the previous night. Mrs. Hargrove listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When Elena finished, the older woman rose and retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf near the fireplace, setting it gently on the table between them. "I have seen these signs many times," she said. "In my judgment, and I have rarely been wrong, you are carrying a child, likely 2 months along, perhaps a little more." The words settled over Elena, like a physical weight, and for a long moment she could not speak. She pressed both hands against her stomach, tears rising unbidden to her eyes, though she could not say whether they came from joy, fear, or some tangled combination of both. "You are certain," she whispered. "As certain as any physician can be without further weeks to confirm it," Mrs. Hargrove said gently. "But your body tells its own story, and I have learned to trust it." Elena closed her eyes, memories flooding through her uninvited, the warmth of Alaric's hand against her cheek during their early courtship, the quiet nights they had spent dreaming of the future, the child they had once spoken of wanting, before pride and suspicion had torn everything apart in a single cruel evening. "He does not know," she said softly. "He cast me out before I even understood it myself." Mrs. Hargrove's expression sharpened slightly, though her voice remained calm. "Then you carry a secret heavier than most women ever bear alone," she said. "And you must decide, carefully and without haste, what to do with that knowledge." Elena opened her eyes, meeting the older woman's steady gaze. "What would you advise?" "I cannot make that choice for you," Mrs. Hargrove said. "But I will tell you this. A man who casts aside his wife without listening to her first is not a man ready to hear reason, however true it may be. If you go to him now, in anger, in grief, in this fragile state, you may find yourself facing the same cruelty that sent you away last night, only doubled by suspicion that you invented this news to win back his favor." Elena's stomach tightened at the thought. She had not considered that Alaric, blinded by whatever lies had been fed to him, might view news of a child as yet another manipulation, another scheme conjured to reclaim her position. "Then what do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hargrove reached across the table and took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her years. "You survive," she said simply. "You protect this child with everything you have, and you wait until the truth of whatever happened at that estate reveals itself, as truth so often does, in its own time. And when that time comes, you will decide what is owed to you, and what is owed to him." Elena nodded slowly, a fragile resolve beginning to form within her, though grief still pressed heavily against her chest. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Willowmere, warming the wet fields and glinting off the slow-moving river. Elena sat quietly in Mrs. Hargrove's cottage, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, and made a silent promise to the child growing within her. Whatever cruelty had cast her from her home, she would build a new life strong enough to shelter them both, no matter how long that task might take. For the first time since the carriage had rattled away from Thornfield's gates, Elena felt something steadier than despair settling into her heart. It was not yet hope, not fully, but it was the beginning of purpose, and in that quiet cottage smelling of lavender and wood smoke, purpose was enough to carry her forward into whatever came next. Weeks passed in Willowmere, and Elena learned to measure time not by the grand rhythms of estate life she once knew, but by smaller, quieter markers. The changing color of leaves along the riverbank, the gradual rounding of her figure beneath loose-fitting dresses, the steady kindness of two women who asked for nothing in return for their friendship. Margaret Bell had offered her a small room above the inn in exchange for help with the daily baking, an arrangement that suited them both. Elena discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she enjoyed the work. The rhythm of kneading dough, the warmth of the ovens, the simple satisfaction of feeding hungry travelers who knew nothing of dukes or estates or forged documents, offered a strange comfort she had never found in the polished halls of Thornfield. Mrs. Hargrove visited often, checking on her health with quiet professionalism, though their conversations gradually deepened beyond matters of physical well-being. The older woman had buried a husband and outlived 2 children of her own, and something in Elena's quiet resilience seemed to remind her of losses long past. "You carry yourself like someone building a wall," Mrs. Hargrove observed one afternoon, as they sat together near the cottage's small garden, autumn sunlight slanting golden across rows of drying herbs, brick by brick, without complaint. Elena smiled faintly, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. "What else is there to do?" she asked. "I cannot return to Thornfield. I cannot demand justice from a man who would not hear me before condemning me. So I build something new instead." "And when the child comes," Mrs. Hargrove asked gently, "what will you tell them about their father?" Elena's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more complicated, grief tangled with lingering tenderness. "The truth," she said finally, "whatever that truth turns out to be by then." Mrs. Hargrove nodded, understanding the weight behind those simple words, and said nothing further on the matter that day. News from beyond Willowmere reached Elena only in fragments, carried by traveling merchants who stopped at the inn for a night's rest and shared gossip freely over warm meals. She learned, through overheard conversation rather than direct inquiry, that Duke Thorn had grown increasingly withdrawn since his wife's sudden departure, that servants whispered of his foul temper and sleepless nights, that his cousin Reginald Vane had taken on greater responsibility over the estate's daily affairs in her absence. She listened to these fragments with a carefully guarded heart, refusing to let herself hope that Alaric's darkened mood meant regret rather than simple inconvenience at having lost a capable wife who had once managed half the estate's correspondence and tenant affairs without complaint. Yet despite her resolve, certain nights proved harder than others. She would wake from dreams of Thornfield's gardens, of Alaric's laughter beneath the apple trees, of a version of her husband that existed only in memory now, and find herself weeping quietly into her pillow before forcing the tears away and reminding herself of Mrs. Hargrove's steady counsel: survive first, decide later. One crisp morning in late autumn, as Elena helped Margaret arrange fresh bread along the inn's front counter, a stranger entered through the front door, shaking rain from his coat. He was a thin, sharp-eyed man with the bearing of someone accustomed to asking questions and expecting honest answers. "Good morning," he said, addressing Margaret with polite formality. "I am seeking lodging for a few nights, and perhaps some local knowledge as well. I am searching for information regarding a woman who may have passed through this region some months ago, Elena's hands froze mid-motion, though she kept her face carefully neutral, turning slightly away to continue arranging loaves along the shelf. Margaret, ever composed, answered smoothly. Willowmere sees many travelers, sir. What manner of woman do you seek? The stranger produced a small notebook, flipping through pages of careful handwriting. A woman of gentle bearing, dark hair, likely traveling alone, or with minimal escort, arriving sometime in early autumn. I have been retained to locate her on behalf of a family concerned for her welfare. Elena's pulse quickened, though she forced herself to continue her work, breathing slowly, willing her expression to remain unremarkable. She did not recognize the man, but something in his careful phrasing, family concerned for her welfare, struck her as deliberately vague, the kind of language used by someone paid to search, without revealing too much about who had hired them, or why. I cannot recall such a woman passing through recently, Margaret said easily, her tone pleasant and unbothered. But you are welcome to take a room and ask around the village. Perhaps someone else has seen her. The stranger thanked her, arranged for a room, and retreated upstairs, though not before glancing once more around the common room, with the careful attentiveness of someone accustomed to noticing details others might miss. The moment he disappeared up the staircase, Margaret turned to Elena, her earlier composure giving way to visible concern. You know something of this, she said quietly, not quite a question. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she set down the bread she had been arranging. I do not know who sent him, she admitted, but I fear it may not be safety he has been hired to ensure. That evening, once the inn had grown quiet and the stranger had retired to his room, Elena slipped out the back entrance and made her way through the darkening streets to Mrs. Hargrove's cottage, her heart pounding with every step. The older woman listened carefully as Elena described the stranger's questions, his careful phrasing, the unsettling sense that his search was not born from concern, but from calculation. If someone has sent an investigator searching for you, Mrs. Hargrove said slowly, it may mean the truth of what happened at Thornfield is beginning to unravel, whether through your husband's own doubts or through someone else's carelessness. Or it may mean, Elena said, her voice tightening, that whoever forged those documents against me fears I might return and expose them, and wishes to ensure I am silenced before that can happen. The two women sat in tense silence for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, autumn wind rattling gently against the shuttered windows. You must be careful, Mrs. Hargrove said finally. Careful of who you speak with, careful of where you go, and most importantly, careful never to reveal your condition to anyone whose loyalties you cannot be certain of. Elena nodded, one hand instinctively resting over her rounded stomach, protective instinct sharpening into something closer to fierce determination. Whatever danger approaches, she said quietly, I will not let it touch this child. Mrs. Hargrove reached across and squeezed her hand firmly. Then we will be ready for it, she said, together. Over the following days, Elena moved through Willowmere with heightened caution, avoiding the inn's common room during hours when the stranger, who introduced himself only as Mr. Colton, was likely to be present, and taking care never to be seen alone on the village streets after dusk. Colton lingered in the village for nearly a week, asking careful questions of shopkeepers and travelers, though he never seemed to gain the answers he sought. Willowmere's residents, protective of the quiet, kind seamstress who had recently joined their small community, offered him little beyond polite deflection. Eventually, he departed as quietly as he had arrived, though Elena remained uneasy long after his carriage disappeared down the road, leading away from the village. She could not shake the feeling that his search, whether born of genuine concern or something darker, marked only the beginning of forces beyond her control, converging once more around her life. Meanwhile, far from Willowmere, within the grand study of Thornfield Estate, Duke Alaric Thorne sat alone late into the night, staring at documents he had reviewed 100 times since the evening he had cast his wife from their home. Something had continued to trouble him in the weeks since her departure. A small, persistent unease he could not fully silence, despite his cousin's continued reassurances. He had asked, more than once, to see the original bank records referenced in the forged evidence, only to be told repeatedly by Reginald that the relevant documents had been misplaced or destroyed during a recent reorganization of the estate's financial archives. Such carelessness seemed unlike the meticulous account-keeping Thornfield had always maintained, and Alaric found himself, against his own inclination toward pride, growing increasingly suspicious of the explanations offered to him. He had also begun noticing smaller inconsistencies, servants who grew quiet and evasive when questioned about the night of Elena's departure, ledger entries that did not quite align with Reginald's verbal accounts of estate spending, a persistent sense that pieces of the story he had been told did not fit together as cleanly as they once seemed to. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Alaric summoned his steward, a loyal and long-serving man named Edmund Byrne, to his study. "Edmund," he said, once the door had closed behind them, "I wish to review the estate's financial records from the past year myself, in full, without summary or interpretation from anyone else." Byrne hesitated slightly before answering, a flicker of something Alaric could not quite name crossing his weathered features. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "if I may speak plainly, there are matters within those records that have troubled me for some time, matters I did not feel it was my place to raise unprompted." Alaric straightened in his chair, a cold weight settling in his stomach. "Speak plainly now," he said. "I command it." Byrne glanced toward the closed door, as though ensuring no one else might overhear, before continuing in a lowered voice. "Several withdrawals attributed to the Duchess's authority were made during periods when I can personally attest she was occupied elsewhere on estate business, tending to tenant matters in the eastern fields, matters that required her full attention, and left no opportunity for the financial dealings described in the evidence brought before you." Alaric's breath caught in his throat. "Why did you not say this before?" he demanded, though his tone carried more desperation than anger. "I feared contradicting Master Reginald without absolute proof," Byrne admitted. "He holds considerable influence over the household now, and I did not wish to risk my position, or worse, based on mere suspicion rather than certainty." Alaric rose from his chair, pacing slowly before the fire, his mind racing through weeks of accumulated doubt, now crystallizing into something far more urgent than mere unease. "Bring me every original document," he said finally. "Every ledger, every letter, every piece of evidence used against her, and let us examine them together, without my cousin's involvement, without his interpretation guiding our conclusions." Byrne nodded solemnly. "As you command, Your Grace. Though I fear what we may find may complicate matters far beyond what either of us currently understands." Alaric turned to face his steward directly, the weight of weeks of misplaced certainty finally beginning to crack beneath the surface of his carefully maintained composure. "Then we shall face that complication together," he said quietly, "and pray it is not already too late to correct whatever wrong has been done." Outside the study windows, the autumn wind rattled softly against the glass, carrying with it the first cold whispers of the coming winter, a season that would test both the strength of the woman who had been cast away and the resolve of the man beginning, at last, to question the choices that had driven her from his life. Snow had begun falling over Willowmere by the time Edmund Byrne gathered every original document from Thornfield's financial archives and carried them, along with a growing weight of dread, into Alaric's study. The two men worked through the night by candlelight, spreading ledgers and letters across the wide desk, comparing dates, signatures, and figures with painstaking care. What emerged from their examination proved far more troubling than either had anticipated. The withdrawals attributed to Elena's authority bore signatures that, upon close comparison with genuine samples of her handwriting preserved in old estate correspondence, revealed subtle but unmistakable inconsistencies. A slight tremor in certain letters, an unfamiliar slant that did not match the confident, flowing script Alaric remembered from years of shared correspondence during their courtship. "This is not her hand," Alaric said quietly, holding two letters side by side beneath the candlelight. "Look here, and here. The genuine letters flow without hesitation. These forgeries falter, as though someone practiced her signature without fully mastering its natural rhythm." Byrne nodded gravely, tracing his finger along a series of dated ledger entries. "And these withdrawals, Your Grace. They align precisely with dates I can personally confirm the Duchess was occupied elsewhere, meeting with tenant families regarding the autumn harvest arrangements. She could not have authorized these transactions from locations she never visited." Alaric sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, the full weight of what this meant settling over him like a physical burden. "If she did not authorize these withdrawals," he said slowly, "then someone else did. Someone with sufficient access to estate finances and sufficient knowledge of her signature to attempt this forgery convincingly. Byrne hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice the conclusion both men had likely already reached independently. Your cousin has held considerable access to the estate's financial dealings in recent months, he said carefully. Since before the Duchess's departure, in fact, given his increasing involvement in daily management matters. Alaric closed his eyes briefly, memories rushing back with painful clarity. Reginald's careful, sympathetic presentation of the evidence, that fateful evening, his quiet suggestions about how quickly the matter should be resolved, his subtle discouragement whenever Alaric had considered giving Elena a chance to explain herself before condemning her entirely. I dismissed her without allowing her a single word in her own defense, he said, his voice hollow with dawning horror. I believed my cousin's account without question, because grief and pride convinced me that swift action proves strength rather than foolishness. Your Grace, Byrne said gently, self-blame will not undo what has already occurred, but it may guide what we do next. Alaric opened his eyes, a new resolve hardening beneath the horror of his realization. We must find her, he said firmly. We must locate Elena, present her with proof of this deception, and correct this injustice before further harm can be done, both to her reputation and to whatever remains of the trust between us. Byrne nodded slowly, though a note of caution entered his voice. Finding her may prove difficult, Your Grace. She departed without instruction regarding her destination, and given the circumstances of her departure, she may have chosen deliberately to remain concealed from further contact with this household. Alaric considered this for a long moment before reaching a decision. Then we shall hire someone skilled in locating those who do not wish to be found, he said, discreetly, and without alerting my cousin to our efforts, until we possess proof sufficient to confront him directly. Byrne inclined his head in agreement. I know of a man suited to such delicate work, Your Grace. A former investigator named Mr. Colton, known for his discretion and thoroughness. Alaric nodded firmly. Send for him at once. Whatever the cost, whatever the delay, we must uncover the truth of where Elena has gone, and what has become of her since that terrible night. As Byrne departed to arrange the necessary correspondence, Alaric remained alone in his study, staring at the forged documents spread across his desk, documents that had convinced him to destroy his own marriage in a single evening of misplaced certainty. He thought of Elena's face in the moment he had ordered her removal, the disbelief and heartbreak that had flashed across her features before he had turned away, refusing to let himself witness the full weight of what he was doing. I did not even look at her properly, he murmured to the empty room. I could not bear to see the truth in her eyes, because some part of me already suspected I was wrong, and I chose pride over courage regardless. Outside, snow continued falling steadily over Thornfield's grounds, blanketing the gardens where he and Elena had once walked together during happier seasons, burying the earth beneath a silence that mirrored the cold distance now stretching between them. Meanwhile, in the study's antechamber, unseen by either Alaric or Byrne, Reginald Vane stood pressed against the shadowed wall beside a partially open door, having arrived to discuss unrelated estate matters only to overhear fragments of their conversation regarding the forged signatures and the planned investigation. His expression, usually composed and pleasant, tightened into something colder and more calculating as he absorbed the implications of what he had overheard. He withdrew quietly, careful to avoid detection, his mind already racing through the possibilities before him. If Alaric discovered the full truth of his deception, discovered that Reginald had orchestrated Elena's downfall specifically to position himself as the estate's likely heir, in the absence of any legitimate offspring from the marriage, the consequences would prove catastrophic, not merely to his reputation, but potentially to his freedom itself. He needed to act quickly, before any investigator could locate Elena, and provide her the opportunity to expose the forgery directly to Alaric. If she remained missing, or better yet, permanently silenced regarding the truth of what had transpired, his position would remain secure, regardless of whatever suspicions Alaric harbored. Reginald made his way to his private chambers, his thoughts sharpening into cold calculation as he considered his next move. He possessed contacts of his own, individuals accustomed to handling delicate matters with appropriate discretion, individuals who could locate a missing woman far more quickly than any investigator working openly on Alaric's behalf, particularly if that investigation remained unaware it was engaged in a race against a rival search. He seated himself at his private desk and began composing a carefully worded letter, one that would set in motion efforts to locate Elena before Burns' chosen investigator could reach her first, efforts that carried far darker intentions than mere reconciliation. As he sealed the letter and prepared it for immediate delivery, Reginald allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, confident that his careful planning would once again ensure his position remained unthreatened, regardless of whatever doubts his cousin had begun to entertain. He did not yet know that Elena carried within her a secret that would transform this entire conflict into something far more consequential than a simple matter of inheritance and reputation, a secret that, once revealed, would render his schemes considerably more desperate and considerably more dangerous for everyone involved. Back in Willowmere, unaware of the storm gathering around her fate, Elena continued her quiet life at the inn, her pregnancy advancing steadily through the winter months, her bond with Margaret and Mrs. Hargrove deepening into something resembling true family in the absence of the family she had lost. She could not have known, as she helped prepare the inn for the coming holiday season, that two separate searches, one born of genuine remorse and one born of desperate self-preservation, were both converging toward the quiet village she had come to call home, each carrying consequences that would soon force her from the careful anonymity she had worked so hard to build. The pains began in the early hours before dawn, sharp and insistent, pulling Elena from a restless sleep with a gasp that echoed through the quiet room above the inn. She pressed a hand against her swollen stomach, breathing through the tightening sensation as Mrs. Hargrove's earlier instructions rushed back to her. Count the moments between each pain. Remain calm. Send word the instant the intervals grew close together. "Margaret," she called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. "Margaret, I believe the child is coming." Within minutes, the entire inn had roused into quiet, purposeful activity. Margaret sent her husband running through the dark, snow-dusted streets to fetch Mrs. Hargrove, while she herself worked quickly to prepare the room, gathering clean linens and warming water over the hearth fire. Elena gripped the edge of the bed frame, each wave of pain arriving stronger and closer than the last, sweat beading across her forehead despite the winter chill seeping through the shuttered windows. Fear mingled with something fiercer inside her, a determination that had been building for months, ever since the night she had first learned of the life growing within her. Mrs. Hargrove arrived within the half hour, her composed presence immediately steadying the room's anxious energy. She examined Elena quickly and efficiently, her weathered hands moving with the practiced confidence of 30 years' experience. "You are further along than I expected," she said calmly. "This child is eager to meet the world. Breathe with me now, Elena. In through the nose, slowly, and let the pain move through you rather than fighting against it." The hours that followed blurred together for Elena, a haze of pain and effort, and Margaret's steady voice offering encouragement, of Mrs. Hargrove's calm instructions guiding her through each contraction, of the winter dawn slowly brightening beyond the shuttered window as the birth progressed. When the final, overwhelming push finally brought new life into the world, the room fell silent for one suspended moment before a thin, indignant cry broke through the quiet, startling and beautiful all at once. "A son," Mrs. Hargrove announced, her voice thick with emotion despite her professional composure, as she carefully wrapped the newborn in warmed linen and placed him gently against Elena's chest. A strong, healthy son. Elena stared down at the small, red-faced infant now nestled against her, tears streaming freely down her cheeks as she took in every detail of his tiny features, the dark tuft of hair, the delicate curve of his nose, that reminded her instantly, painfully, of his father. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice breaking with exhaustion and overwhelming love in equal measure. "Welcome to a world that has not been entirely kind to your mother, but I promise you, I will make it kind to you." Margaret wept openly beside the bed, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron, while Mrs. Hargrove busied herself with the final tasks of the birth, allowing mother and child their first quiet moments together. "What will you name him?" Margaret asked softly, once the room had settled into peaceful exhaustion. Elena considered the question for a long moment, studying her son's small, sleeping face, searching for a name that felt right for the boy who would grow up without knowledge of the grand estate that should rightfully have been his birthright. "Julian," she said finally. "His name will be Julian." "A fine name," Mrs. Hargrove said approvingly, settling into a chair beside the bed with visible exhaustion of her own. "And now, my dear, you must rest. Motherhood begins immediately. but so too does the necessity of recovery. In the weeks that followed Julian's birth, Elena settled into the exhausting, joyful rhythm of caring for a newborn, her days structured around feeding schedules and brief snatches of sleep, her heart expanding in ways she had never anticipated possible. Yet even amid the overwhelming demands of new motherhood, thoughts of Alaric continued to surface, unbidden and persistent. She found herself, late at night, while nursing Julian by candlelight, composing letters in her mind, imagining how she might explain the truth of his son's existence, imagining his reaction upon learning he had a child he knew nothing about. She began, eventually, to put these imagined words onto actual paper, drafting letter after letter in the quiet hours of the night. Yet each time she finished a draft, doubt would creep back in, and she would fold the letter carefully before feeding it to the fire instead of sending it. "What if he believes I invented this child to reclaim my position?" she confided to Mrs. Hargrove one afternoon, as the older woman visited to check on both mother and infant's health. "What if he demands to take Julian from me the moment he learns of him, believing a son deserves the privileges of Thornfield regardless of what he thinks of me?" Mrs. Hargrove considered the question carefully before responding, watching as Julian slept peacefully in a small basket near the fire. "Those are valid fears," she said. "A man capable of casting aside his wife without hearing her defense might well prove capable of separating a mother from her child in pursuit of an heir." "Then I am right to remain silent," Elena said, though uncertainty still lingered in her voice. "I did not say that," Mrs. Hargrove replied gently. "I said your fears hold merit, but secrets rarely remain buried forever, particularly secrets involving matters as significant as the birth of an heir to a dukedom. Sooner or later, the truth will surface, whether through your own choice or through circumstances beyond your control. It may serve you better to consider carefully how you wish that truth to emerge, rather than allowing fate to determine the timing and manner entirely on its own." Elena absorbed this counsel in thoughtful silence, watching her son's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath, weighing the protective instinct that urged her toward continued secrecy against the quiet recognition that Mrs. Hargrove's warning carried genuine wisdom. For now, she decided, she would continue building her quiet life in Willowmere, providing Julian with safety and stability, while she remained uncertain of what awaited them should the truth of his parentage ever reach Thornfield's ears. But she resolved to remain watchful, attentive to any signs that circumstances might be shifting beyond her control, ready to act decisively should the moment demand it. She could not have known, as she made this careful resolution, that circumstances were already shifting rapidly beyond the quiet borders of Willowmere, that two men, one driven by genuine remorse and one driven by desperate self-preservation, were each drawing steadily closer to discovering the secret she had worked so hard to protect. As winter gradually softened into the first tentative signs of spring, Elena continued her work at the inn, now with baby Julian often sleeping nearby in a basket, while she assisted Margaret with the daily baking and household tasks. The villagers of Willowmere, who had grown fond of the quiet, hard-working young woman during her months among them, welcomed the arrival of her son with warm congratulations and small gifts of clothing and blankets, asking few questions about the father's absence, respecting the privacy she had clearly chosen to maintain. Elena found genuine comfort in this small, accepting community, a stark contrast to the rigid formality and quiet suspicion that had characterized much of her life at Thornfield. Even during the happier early years of her marriage, she began to wonder, in quiet moments of reflection, whether the life she had built here, humble as it was, might ultimately prove more genuine and more fulfilling than anything she could have found within the estate's grand but often cold walls. Yet even as this new life took shape around her, the shadow of Thornfield never fully receded from her thoughts. She watched Julian grow week by week, noting the small ways he already resembled his father, the particular tilt of his head when curious, the intensity of his gaze even as an infant, and wondered, with a mixture of longing and apprehension, what future truly awaited her son, beyond the quiet borders of the village that had become their sanctuary. Spring arrived fully across Willowmere, bringing warmer days and the first blooms of wildflowers along the riverbank, and Elena allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that perhaps this peaceful chapter of her life might continue undisturbed for years to come. She did not yet know how quickly that fragile hope would be tested by forces already converging toward the village she had come to call home. 5 years slipped by with the quiet persistence of a river, carving its path through stone, and Willowmere had become, in every way that mattered, home to Elena and her son. Julian had grown into a bright, curious boy with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples and eyes that seemed to study the world around him with unusual thoughtfulness for someone so young. He spent his days helping Margaret's husband tend the inn's small garden, chasing chickens across the yard with delighted shrieks, and pestering Mrs. Hargrove with endless questions about the herbs and remedies she kept in careful rows along her cottage windowsill. Elena had established herself as a skilled seamstress, her careful stitching and elegant designs earning a modest but steady reputation throughout the surrounding villages. She had saved enough over the years to rent a small cottage of her own, separate from the inn, where she and Julian could enjoy a measure of privacy while still remaining close to the friends who had become their chosen family. "Mama," Julian said one evening, looking up from the wooden toy horse Mrs. Hargrove's late husband had carved decades earlier and passed down through the years, "why do the other children have fathers who visit, and I do not?" Elena set down her needlework, considering her response carefully, as she had considered similar questions in the years since Julian had grown old enough to notice such things. "Some fathers are far away, dealing with matters that keep them from home," she said gently. "It does not mean they would not love you, if circumstances were different." Julian accepted this answer with the easy trust of a young child, returning his attention to his toy horse, though Elena's heart ached with the weight of everything she had not yet found the courage to explain. She had continued, over the years, to hear occasional fragments of news from Thornfield, carried by traveling merchants who passed through Willowmere and shared gossip freely in exchange for warm meals and comfortable lodging. She learned that Duke Thorn had grown increasingly reclusive, rarely attending social gatherings that had once been customary for a man of his position, that whispers persisted throughout the county regarding tension between him and his cousin Reginald, though the precise nature of that tension remained unclear to those outside the estate's inner circle. She had also learned, with a complicated mixture of relief and unease, that no further investigators had appeared in Willowmere since Mr. Colton's brief and unsuccessful visit 5 years earlier, suggesting that whatever search had prompted his inquiries had either concluded or been abandoned entirely. What Elena did not know, as she went about her quiet daily routine of sewing and caring for her son, was that Alaric had never truly abandoned his search for her, that the investigation had continued steadily behind the scenes, hampered repeatedly by mysterious obstacles that always seemed to arise whenever progress appeared imminent, obstacles orchestrated carefully by Reginald to protect his own increasingly precarious position. Within Thornfield's walls, the atmosphere had grown steadily more strained over the passing years. Alaric had confirmed, to his own satisfaction and Burns' careful documentation, that the evidence used to condemn Elena had indeed been forged, likely by his own cousin's hand, though proving this conclusively enough to take decisive action against a blood relative had proven far more difficult than simply recognizing the truth privately. Reginald, meanwhile, had grown increasingly bold in his management of the estate's affairs, gradually expanding his influence over financial decisions and household matters, positioning himself, in the absence of any legitimate heir from Alaric's now dissolved marriage, as the most logical successor to the dukedom should anything unfortunate befall his cousin. Alaric, consumed by guilt and growing suspicion in equal measure, found himself trapped in a peculiar paralysis, unwilling to act rashly against Reginald without absolute proof, yet unable to fully trust his cousin's continued counsel regarding the estate's management, and haunted constantly by memories of the wife he had cast aside, without allowing her a single word in her own defense. "Your Grace," Burns said one evening, finding Alaric once again alone in his study, staring at old letters preserved from happier years of his marriage, "Mr. Colton has sent word requesting additional resources to continue the search. He believes recent developments may finally yield results." Alaric looked up, a flicker of cautious hope crossing his weary features. "What developments?" he asked. "A merchant recently returned from a village called Willowmere, some distance to the north," Byrne explained. "He mentioned, in passing conversation with one of our stable hands, a seamstress living there who matched certain details of the Duchess's description, though the merchant could not confirm this with certainty." Alaric rose immediately from his chair, energy returning to his exhausted frame for the first time in what felt like months. "Send Colton there at once," he said firmly. "And Edmund, Ensure this instruction reaches him directly, without passing through any intermediary who might delay or complicate the matter." Byrne hesitated slightly before responding, his expression carrying evident concern. "Your Grace, if I may ask, why do you specify such caution regarding intermediaries?" Alaric's jaw tightened, old suspicions hardening into something closer to certainty. "Because I no longer trust that every obstacle we have encountered these past years has been mere coincidence," he said quietly. "I believe someone within this household has actively worked to prevent this search from succeeding, and I intend to discover who and why before this matter progresses any further." Byrne nodded solemnly, understanding the implication clearly without requiring further explanation. "I will ensure the instruction reaches Mr. Colton directly and swiftly, Your Grace, without delay or interference." As Byrne departed to arrange the necessary correspondence, Alaric remained alone once more in his study, staring out at the darkening gardens beyond his window, gardens where he and Elena had once walked together during the brief, happy years, before pride and deception had torn their marriage apart. "Elena," he murmured softly to the empty room, "if you are truly in this village Byrne describes, I swear I will make right what I destroyed that terrible night, whatever the cost, whatever the effort required." He did not yet know the full extent of what awaited discovery in Willowmere, did not yet understand that the woman he sought had spent the past 5 years raising a son who bore his own features, a son who represented not merely a personal reconciliation, but the future security of Thornfield's entire legacy. Meanwhile, unaware that her carefully guarded anonymity was once again under threat, Elena continued her quiet evening routine with Julian, helping him prepare for bed as the last light of day faded beyond their cottage windows. "Tell me a story, Mama," Julian requested, as he did most evenings, settling beneath his blankets with sleepy anticipation. Elena smiled, settling into the chair beside his small bed, drawing from the endless well of tales she had crafted over the years to entertain her curious, thoughtful son. "Once," she began softly, "there was a kingdom far away, ruled by a kind and just family, who cared deeply for all who lived within their lands." She did not yet know how soon her carefully constructed peace would be tested, how quickly the quiet life she had built in Willowmere would be thrust once more into the turbulent currents of Thornfield's ongoing conflict. Currents that were already, even as she spoke these gentle bedtime words to her son, drawing steadily and inexorably closer to their small, unsuspecting cottage. Mr. Colton arrived in Willowmere on a bright morning in early summer, 5 years older than his first unsuccessful visit, though no less determined in his methodical approach to the task at hand. He began his inquiries carefully, mindful of the resistance he had encountered during his previous search, taking rooms once again at Margaret Bell's Inn, under a different, more neutral pretext, regarding business matters unrelated to any personal search. Yet Willowmere had changed in subtle ways during the intervening years, and Colton found the villagers somewhat less guarded than they had been previously, perhaps because sufficient time had passed that the urgency surrounding his earlier visit had faded from collective memory, replaced by the comfortable familiarity of a village that had long since accepted a certain quiet seamstress and her young son as permanent fixtures of their community. Through careful, patient conversation over several days, Colton gradually pieced together enough details to feel confident he had finally located the woman he sought, a seamstress named Elena, living in a small cottage at the village's edge, raising a young son of approximately 5 years, a boy whose features, according to several villagers he spoke with, bore a striking resemblance to a particular description he had carried with him for years without success. Rather than approaching Elena directly, mindful of Alaric's specific instructions to proceed with caution, given ongoing suspicions regarding interference within the household, Colton composed a careful letter to be delivered directly to Byrne, detailing his findings and requesting further instruction before making contact. Unfortunately for Colton's carefully measured approach, his inquiries had not gone entirely unnoticed. A stable hand employed at Thornfield, a young man recently hired and unaware of the sensitive nature of the ongoing search, mentioned Colton's renewed investigation in passing conversation to another servant, conversation that was subsequently overheard by someone loyal to Reginald Vane rather than to the Duke himself. Within hours, word reached Reginald that Colton's search had likely succeeded, that Elena had been located in a village called Willowmere, and that she appeared to be raising a young son whose age aligned precisely with the timeline of her departure from Thornfield 5 years earlier. Reginald absorbed this information with cold, calculating precision, immediately recognizing the catastrophic implications for his own position. If Elena possessed a legitimate son by Alaric, a true heir to the dukedom, his own carefully constructed path toward eventual inheritance would collapse entirely, regardless of whatever suspicions Alaric harbored regarding the forged evidence from years past. He could not allow this discovery to reach fruition. Whatever measures proved necessary, he resolved, he would ensure that Elena and her son never returned to complicate his carefully constructed future at Thornfield. Reginald summoned 2 men he had employed previously, for matters requiring discretion beyond what ordinary servants could be trusted to handle, men accustomed to operating in the shadows of legitimate estate business, and provided them with detailed instructions regarding Willowmere, Elena's likely location, and the urgent necessity of ensuring she and her son remained permanently silenced regarding any claim to Thornfield's legacy. "I care not how this matter is resolved," he told them coldly, "only that it concludes swiftly, quietly, and without any trace leading back to this estate." The men departed that same evening, traveling swiftly toward Willowmere, with instructions that carried far darker implications than the careful, measured approach Colton had employed on Alaric's behalf. Meanwhile, unaware of the danger now approaching, Elena continued her ordinary summer routine, spending a peaceful afternoon in her cottage garden, while Julian played nearby, with a small collection of wooden toys, chattering happily about the adventures he imagined for his carved horse and its companions. "Mama, look," Julian called out, holding up a beetle he had discovered crawling along a garden stone, its shell gleaming iridescent blue and green in the afternoon sunlight. Elena set down her needlework to admire his discovery, smiling at his evident delight in the small wonders of the natural world around him. "That is a beautiful creature," she said. "Be gentle with it, and then let it continue on its journey." Julian nodded seriously, cupping the beetle carefully in his small hands before setting it back among the garden stones, watching with rapt attention as it resumed its slow, determined path. As evening approached, Elena prepared a simple dinner while Julian helped set the small table, chattering happily about his day's adventures, entirely unaware that 2 dangerous men were even now approaching Willowmere's outskirts, their intentions far removed from the peaceful domesticity of the cottage they were seeking. The men arrived in the village under cover of darkness, taking careful note of the inn's layout and making discreet inquiries at a tavern some distance from Margaret Bell's establishment, mindful of avoiding the same networks of village gossip that had previously frustrated Colton's earlier, more legitimate search. Through patient, methodical observation over the following day, they confirmed Elena's cottage location and began formulating their approach, watching carefully for opportunities when mother and child might be found alone and vulnerable, away from the protective community that had sheltered them for the past 5 years. Elena, entirely unaware of the danger circling closer with each passing hour, continued her quiet routine, though a vague, unsettling sense of being watched began to creep over her during her final errand of the day, a feeling she attributed initially to simple fatigue rather than genuine threat. That evening, as she walked home from the village market with Julian's small hand clasped firmly in hers, she noticed, from the corner of her eye, an unfamiliar figure lingering near the edge of the road, watching their progress with an attention that felt distinctly deliberate rather than casual. She quickened her pace slightly, pulling Julian closer against her side, an old instinct from her days at Thornfield resurfacing suddenly and insistently, the recognition that not every danger announces itself openly, that some threats prefer to observe quietly before striking with sudden, devastating force. "Mama, why are we walking so fast?" Julian asked, his small voice carrying a note of confusion at her uncharacteristic urgency. "Just eager to get home for supper, my darling," Elena said, forcing lightness into her tone, despite the growing unease tightening in her chest. They reached their cottage without further incident, and Elena secured the door carefully behind them, though the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered long into the evening, refusing to fully dissipate, despite her attempts to attribute it to simple imagination and exhaustion. She did not yet know how correct her instincts truly were, did not yet understand the full scope of the danger that had traveled from Thornfield, specifically to silence her, and the son she had protected so carefully for the past 5 years. danger that would test every ounce of courage and resourcefulness she had developed since the night she had first been cast from her former home. The following afternoon, Elena left Julian in Margaret's care at the inn, while she delivered a finished garment to a customer on the far side of the village, a routine errand she had completed countless times over the years without incident. She had barely returned to collect her son when Margaret met her at the inn's entrance, her usually composed features etched with visible worry. "Elena," she said quickly, keeping her voice low, "two strangers came asking after Julian while you were away, claiming to represent a distant relative wishing to arrange a surprise gift for the boy. Something about their manner troubled me deeply, and I told them nothing, though they lingered near the stables for some time before finally departing." Elena's blood ran cold, every protective instinct she had cultivated over 5 years of quiet vigilance snapping instantly into sharp focus. "Where is Julian now?" she asked urgently. "In the kitchen with my husband, safe and unaware of any concern," Margaret assured her quickly. "But Elena, I do not believe these men intended any innocent purpose. Their questions felt too precise, too focused on details of his daily routine, his usual whereabouts." Elena rushed through to the kitchen, relief flooding through her at the sight of Julian sitting contentedly at the table, sharing a small snack with Margaret's husband, while recounting some elaborate story about his garden beetle from the previous day. She gathered him close, holding him perhaps a moment longer than usual, drawing strength from his warm, solid presence against her. "Mama, you are squeezing too tight," Julian complained good-naturedly, wriggling slightly within her embrace. Elena released him with a small, forced laugh, though her mind raced through possibilities, none of them reassuring. She needed to understand who these men truly were and what danger they represented before she could determine her next course of action. That evening, once Julian had been settled safely to sleep in a spare room at the inn, under Margaret's watchful protection, Elena hurried through darkening streets to Mrs. Hargrove's cottage, seeking counsel from the woman who had guided her through every previous crisis of the past 5 years. Mrs. Hargrove listened with grave attention as Elena described the stranger's inquiries, her weathered features growing increasingly troubled as the account unfolded. "This does not sound like the careful, official inquiry of an investigator working on behalf of concerned family," she said finally. "This sounds like someone attempting to locate a child through deception, someone whose intentions likely involve considerably more danger than a simple reunion." Elena's stomach twisted with fear, though she forced herself to think clearly, rather than succumbing entirely to panic. "If someone has learned of Julian's existence and wishes him harmed or removed," she said slowly, working through the implications carefully, "it likely means someone at Thornfield fears what his existence represents to their own position." "Reginald Vane," Mrs. Hargrove said quietly, voicing the suspicion both women had privately harbored for years, without sufficient evidence to act upon. "I have never had proof of his involvement in the original forgery against me," Elena said. "But if he learned that a true heir exists, an heir who threatens whatever position he has built at Thornfield during my absence, he would have compelling reason to ensure Julian never returns, to claim what should rightfully be his." The two women sat in tense silence for a long moment, the weight of this realization settling heavily between them. "You cannot remain in Willowmere if this danger has truly followed you here," Mrs. Hargrove said finally. "Whatever protection this village has offered you these past years, it will not prove sufficient against men determined to cause genuine harm." Elena nodded slowly, though uncertainty gripped her regarding what alternative existed. "Where would we go?" she asked. "I have built everything I possess here, my livelihood, my friendships, the only stable life Julian has ever known." "Perhaps," Mrs. Hargrove suggested carefully, "it is time to consider a path you have avoided for 5 years. If danger has followed you specifically because of Julian's claim to Thornfield's legacy, perhaps the safest course now involves confronting that legacy directly, rather than continuing to hide from it." Elena absorbed this suggestion with a complicated mixture of fear and reluctant recognition of its logic. "You suggest I return to Thornfield," she said slowly, "present Julian to his father, and trust that whatever justice exists there will protect us both." "I suggest," Mrs. Hargrove said gently, "that hiding has kept you safe for 5 years, but it has not resolved the underlying danger that has now found you regardless. Perhaps the only true safety lies in confronting this matter directly, with whatever evidence and courage you can muster, rather than continuing to run from a threat that clearly knows where to find you." Elena spent that night wrestling with the weight of this decision, torn between the protective instinct that had guided her for 5 years and the growing recognition that continued concealment might no longer offer genuine safety for herself or her son. The following morning, her decision crystallized with sudden, unexpected urgency when Margaret's husband, rising early to tend the stables, discovered fresh footprints near the small window of the room where Julian had slept the previous night. Footprints that did not match any of the inn's usual staff or guests. Elena stared at the evidence with cold, sinking certainty. "They came for him last night," she said quietly, horror settling over her at how narrowly disaster had been avoided through nothing more than fortunate circumstance. Margaret nodded grimly. "We must involve the village constable immediately," she said. "This has moved beyond a matter we can handle through caution alone." Within hours, the village constable, a steady, capable man named Edward Lang, had been briefed on the situation and had organized increased vigilance throughout Willowmere, though he cautioned that whoever had attempted this approach likely possessed resources and determination that a small village's limited resources could not indefinitely resist. "You need protection beyond what Willowmere can offer," he told Elena directly, his expression grave. "Whoever seeks this boy clearly possesses both motivation and means to attempt increasingly desperate measures should their initial efforts fail." Elena listened to this counsel with growing resolve, the fear of the previous night's near disaster finally overcoming 5 years of careful avoidance. She thought of Julian, sleeping peacefully just rooms away, unaware of how close danger had come to touching his innocent life, and she made her decision with sudden, unshakable clarity. "I will go to Thornfield," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear still coursing through her. "Whatever awaits me there, whatever judgment I must face, I will not allow my son to remain vulnerable to whatever scheme threatens him here, hidden away where I cannot properly protect him from forces far beyond a small village's capacity to resist." Mrs. Hargrove reached across and squeezed her hand firmly, pride and concern mingling in her steady gaze. "Then we will prepare you properly for that journey," she said. "And whatever awaits you at Thornfield's gates, know that you do not face it entirely alone, for the courage you have built these past 5 years will serve you well, wherever this path now leads." The journey to Thornfield took 2 full days, Elena and Julian traveling in a carriage arranged by Constable Lang, accompanied by a trusted village guard who insisted on escorting them safely to the estate's very gates. Julian, sensing the seriousness of the journey despite his young age, remained unusually quiet for much of the trip, occasionally asking questions Elena answered as honestly as she felt appropriate for a boy of 5 years to understand. "Where are we going, Mama?" he asked during one long stretch of road, watching unfamiliar countryside pass beyond the carriage window. "To meet someone important," Elena said carefully. "Someone who has been searching for us for a very long time, though he does not yet know precisely what he has been searching for." Julian considered this answer with the thoughtful seriousness that had always characterized his approach to new information. "Is it someone kind?" he asked. Elena hesitated, uncertain how to answer honestly while still offering her son appropriate reassurance. "I believe he wishes to be kind," she said finally. "Whether he succeeds in that wish remains to be discovered together." They arrived at Thornfield's imposing gates on a bright summer afternoon, the grand estate rising exactly as Elena remembered it, though 5 years of distance had transformed her relationship with its stone walls and manicured gardens from comfortable familiarity into something closer to cautious apprehension. The gatekeeper, an older man who had served the family for decades, stared at Elena with visible shock as she stepped down from the carriage, recognition dawning slowly across his weathered features. "Your Grace," he stammered, using her old title with evident confusion regarding proper protocol given the circumstances of her departure years earlier. "I did not expect. That is, we were not informed of your return. Please inform the Duke that Elena has returned," she said steadily, drawing Julian close against her side, "and that she brings someone he needs to meet immediately." Word spread through the household with remarkable speed, and by the time Elena and Julian had walked the long gravel drive toward Thornfield's main entrance, Alaric himself had emerged from within, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief, hope, and barely restrained emotion. He stopped several paces away, his eyes moving from Elena's steady, composed features to the small boy standing beside her, a boy whose dark hair and thoughtful gaze bore an unmistakable resemblance to features Alaric recognized immediately from his own reflection. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with 5 years of accumulated guilt and longing. "You came back." "I did not come back for myself," Elena said, her voice carrying quiet strength, despite the emotion evident beneath her composed exterior. "I came back because my son, your son, was nearly taken from me 2 nights ago, and I could no longer protect him alone against whatever danger has been searching for us." Alaric's gaze dropped to Julian, disbelief and dawning wonder transforming his features as the full weight of Elena's words settled over him. "My son," he repeated softly, kneeling slowly to bring himself to Julian's eye level, his hands trembling slightly as he studied the boy's features with growing certainty. Julian regarded him with the same thoughtful seriousness he had displayed throughout their journey, neither frightened nor immediately trusting, simply observing this stranger, who claimed some unexpected connection to his life. "Are you the person Mama said had been searching for us?" he asked directly. Alaric's composure finally broke, tears gathering in his eyes as he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Though I did not know, until this very moment, precisely what I was searching for." Byrne, alerted immediately to Elena's arrival, hurried out to join them, his own expression carrying evident shock and relief in equal measure. "Your Grace," he said, "perhaps we should continue this reunion somewhere more private, given the sensitivity of the matters we must now discuss." Alaric rose slowly, wiping his eyes with obvious effort to reclaim some composure befitting his position, though his gaze remained fixed on Julian with undisguised wonder. "Yes," he said. "Please, Elena, come inside. There is much we must discuss, and much I must explain regarding the injustice I committed against you 5 years ago." They gathered in Alaric's study, the same room where the forged evidence had once convinced him to cast Elena from their home, though now the atmosphere carried an entirely different weight. Byrne joined them, bringing with him the careful documentation he and Alaric had compiled over the years regarding the forgery's true origins. "I must tell you first," Elena said, once Julian had been settled comfortably with a servant to explore the estate's gardens under careful supervision, "that I did not come here seeking reconciliation for its own sake. I came because Julian's safety demanded it, because someone attempted to take him from me, and I could no longer protect him properly while remaining hidden." Alaric listened with grave attention as Elena described the strangers who had approached the inn, their careful questions about Julian's routine, the footprints discovered beneath his window the very night before their departure from Willowmere. "I believe I understand who bears responsibility for both the original forgery against you and this recent danger to our son," Alaric said, his voice hardening with barely restrained anger, as he gestured toward Byrne, who produced the carefully preserved documentation of their years-long investigation. Byrne explained methodically, laying out each piece of evidence, the inconsistent signatures, the ledger entries that could not align with Elena's actual whereabouts during the periods in question, the growing pattern of obstacles that had repeatedly hindered their search for her over the years, all pointing toward Reginald Vane's calculated involvement in orchestrating her downfall and subsequent efforts to prevent her return. Elena absorbed this confirmation with a complicated mixture of vindication and renewed anger, 5 years of quiet uncertainty, finally crystallizing into concrete understanding of exactly who had destroyed her marriage and threatened her son's safety. "He must be confronted," she said firmly, "and he must be prevented from causing further harm, both to Julian and to whatever remains of Thornfield's rightful legacy." Alaric nodded grimly, resolve hardening across his features. "He will be confronted," he said, "publicly, before the full household, so that his deception cannot be dismissed or minimized through whatever influence he has cultivated during these years of my own misplaced trust." As evening approached, Alaric arranged for Elena and Julian to be settled comfortably within Thornfield's guest quarters, mindful that Reginald remained unaware of their arrival, having been occupied that day with business matters in a neighboring town. "We will confront him tomorrow, before the household staff and any relevant witnesses," Alaric said, "and we will ensure this matter concludes with full transparency, so that neither Julian nor you, Elena, ever again face the danger of hidden schemes and forged accusations." Elena nodded, though exhaustion from the long journey and the emotional weight of the day's events pressed heavily upon her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me this time, without requiring further proof beyond what Julian's presence alone demonstrates." Alaric's expression softened with visible regret. "I should have believed you 5 years ago, without requiring any proof at all," he said. "That failure remains mine to carry, regardless of how tomorrow's confrontation concludes." As night settled over Thornfield, Elena found herself standing once again at the window of a chamber within the grand estate, watching moonlight fall across the same gardens where she had once walked with Alaric during happier years, uncertain what tomorrow's reckoning would ultimately mean for the fragile, complicated reunion now unfolding between them. Reginald returned to Thornfield the following afternoon, entirely unaware that his carefully constructed position had begun unraveling in his absence, and even less aware that the men he had dispatched to Willowmere had failed in their intended purpose. He entered through the main hall with his usual confident bearing, only to find the household staff gathered unusually, whispered conversations falling silent as he passed, glances exchanged that carried none of the deference he had grown accustomed to receiving over the past 5 years. Something in the atmosphere immediately put him on edge, a sense of anticipation that felt distinctly unlike the ordinary rhythm of estate business. Alaric awaited him in the grand hall, standing beside Byrne with an expression of controlled, cold determination that Reginald had never before witnessed directed toward himself. "Cousin," Reginald said carefully, offering his usual pleasant smile despite the unease coiling in his stomach. "You appear troubled. Has something occurred during my absence?" "Something has indeed occurred," Alaric said, his voice carrying across the hall with deliberate clarity, ensuring every gathered servant could hear his words distinctly. "Elena has returned to Thornfield, bringing with her proof of a truth you worked very hard to keep hidden." Reginald's composure flickered, though he recovered quickly, forcing his expression into careful neutrality. "I am pleased to hear the Duchess has returned safely," he said smoothly, "though I confess I do not understand what proof you reference." At that moment, Elena descended the grand staircase, Julian's small hand held firmly in hers, both of them dressed in simple but dignified clothing that carried none of the elaborate finery expected of a state residence. Yet neither of them appeared diminished by its absence. Reginald's gaze fixed immediately on Julian, and for one unguarded instant, genuine shock flashed across his features before he could suppress it, shock that confirmed, more clearly than any document could have, his prior knowledge of exactly what Elena's return truly represented. "This is our son," Alaric said, his voice hardening further as he watched his cousin's reaction with grim satisfaction. "Julian, born 5 years ago, mere months after you presented me with forged evidence, convincing me to cast his mother from our home." Reginald's mouth opened slightly, though no immediate response emerged, his mind clearly racing through possibilities for damage control that grew increasingly limited, given the gathered witnesses now watching the confrontation unfold. "I have no knowledge of any forgery," he said finally, though his voice carried less conviction than his usual confident tone. "The evidence I brought you 5 years ago came from reliable sources within the estate's financial records." Byrne stepped forward, presenting the carefully compiled documentation he and Alaric had assembled over the years, the inconsistent signatures compared directly with genuine samples of Elena's handwriting, the ledger entries that contradicted her verified whereabouts during the periods in question, and finally, testimony gathered discreetly from servants who recalled specific instances of Reginald requesting access to financial records under circumstances that now, in retrospect, appeared clearly calculated toward fabricating false evidence. "Furthermore," Alaric continued, his voice tightening with barely restrained fury, "2 nights ago, men in your employ attempted to approach my son under false pretenses at the village where his mother had taken refuge. Footprints discovered beneath the window of the room where he slept, confirming an attempt that very nearly succeeded in causing him serious harm." The color drained visibly from Reginald's face as this final accusation landed, the gathered household staff murmuring with evident shock and growing anger at the revelation that a member of the family had orchestrated such danger against an innocent child. "I deny any involvement in such an attempt," Reginald said, though desperation had begun creeping into his voice, undermining whatever confidence remained in his denial. Alaric stepped closer, his expression carrying a coldness that matched the fury Reginald had once directed toward Elena 5 years earlier. "You will have opportunity to defend yourself before proper authorities," he said, But you no longer possess any claim to trust or position within this household. Effective immediately, you are removed from all responsibilities regarding Thornfield's management, and formal charges will be prepared regarding both the forgery committed against my wife and the attempted harm against my son." Reginald's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely, desperation transforming into visible panic as he realized the full scope of consequences now converging upon him. "You cannot prove any of this beyond reasonable doubt," he said, his voice rising with barely controlled desperation. "Whatever documents you have gathered, whatever suspicions you harbor, none of it constitutes definitive proof of my involvement." At that moment, one of the household's newer servants stepped forward hesitantly, a young woman who had recently overheard fragments of conversation she had not initially understood the significance of. "Your Grace," she said nervously, addressing Alaric directly, "I overheard Master Reginald, several days past, giving instructions to two unfamiliar men regarding a village to the north. Instructions that mentioned ensuring some matter concluded quietly and without trace. I did not understand the significance at the time, but given what has now been revealed, I believe this testimony may prove relevant." This additional testimony, combined with the documented evidence already presented, proved sufficient to eliminate any remaining doubt among the gathered witnesses regarding Reginald's guilt. His expression crumbled entirely, recognition dawning that his carefully constructed schemes had finally, irrevocably collapsed beyond any possibility of recovery. "I did what was necessary," he said finally, his voice carrying bitter, desperate justification rather than genuine remorse. "This estate should have passed to someone capable of managing it properly, not to whatever heir might emerge from a marriage built on nothing more than sentiment and misplaced trust." Alaric's expression hardened further at this final unrepentant admission. "You will be escorted from this estate immediately," he said, his voice carrying the full authority of his position, "and you will face whatever consequences proper authorities determine appropriate for your actions against my family." As household guards moved to escort Reginald from the premises, Elena stood quietly beside Alaric, Julian's small hand still clasped firmly in hers, watching the collapse of the scheme that had shaped the past 5 years of her life with a complicated mixture of vindication and quiet exhaustion. "It is finished," Alaric said softly, turning to face her directly once Reginald had been removed from the hall, his voice carrying both relief and lingering guilt in equal measure. "The scheme against us is finished," Elena agreed carefully, "but much remains between us that requires honest conversation, beyond simply confirming my innocence and Julian's parentage." Alaric nodded solemnly, understanding clearly that formal vindication, however necessary, did not automatically restore the trust and partnership that had once existed between them before pride and deception had torn their marriage apart. "Then let us begin that conversation," he said quietly. "Whatever time and effort it requires to rebuild what was broken, I am prepared to offer it fully, without reservation or impatience." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for genuine sincerity beneath his words, cautiously allowing herself to consider, for the first time in 5 years, that perhaps some version of reconciliation remained possible between them, built this time on honesty, rather than the fragile assumptions that had once governed their marriage. "Very well," she said finally, "let us begin." In the weeks following Reginald's departure from Thornfield, proper authorities confirmed the full extent of his deception, gathering additional testimony and financial records that corroborated everything Byrne and Alaric had already uncovered. He was formally stripped of any remaining claim to the estate and faced consequences appropriate to the harm he had caused, both to Elena's reputation and to the safety of an innocent child. With the immediate danger resolved, Alaric turned his full attention toward the delicate task of rebuilding what remained between himself and Elena, understanding clearly that formal vindication alone could not erase 5 years of separation and accumulated hurt. He began by insisting on complete honesty regarding every aspect of what had transpired, sitting with Elena each evening after Julian had been settled to bed, listening carefully as she described the difficult years in Willowmere, the fear and uncertainty of raising a child alone, the strength she had drawn from friends like Margaret and Mrs. Hargrove, who had shown her more genuine kindness than the grand halls of Thornfield ever had during moments of true crisis. "I failed you in the moment that mattered most," Alaric said one evening, as they sat together in the same garden where they had once walked happily during their early courtship. I chose pride over trust, speed over patience, and I allowed that failure to cost us 5 years that can never be reclaimed. Elena considered his words carefully before responding, weighing the genuine remorse evident in his voice against the caution she had learned to maintain through years of independent survival. "Those years shaped me into someone stronger than I was before," she said finally. "I do not regret the woman I became in Willowmere, even as I grieve what our family lost during that separation." "Then let us honor both truths," Alaric said. "The strength you built independently, and the future we might still build together, if you are willing to consider such a possibility." Their reconciliation did not happen quickly or without difficulty. Elena insisted on maintaining connections to Willowmere, ensuring Julian understood and valued the community that had sheltered them during his early years, arranging regular visits to see Margaret and Mrs. Hargrove, whose friendship had proven far more valuable than any title or estate during the years of genuine hardship. Alaric, for his part, worked diligently to demonstrate through consistent action, rather than mere words, that he had truly learned from the catastrophic error of judgment that had once destroyed their marriage. He involved Elena fully in matters of estate management, seeking her counsel rather than dismissing her perspective, and he made clear to the entire household that any future accusation against her would require thorough, transparent investigation before any action would be taken. Julian, meanwhile, adapted gradually to his new circumstances, forming a cautious but steadily strengthening bond with the father he was only beginning to know, while never losing the values of kindness and curiosity that had been instilled in him during his formative years in Willowmere's humble but genuine community. "Do you like it here?" Alaric asked him one afternoon, as they walked together through Thornfield's gardens, Julian pointing out various plants with the same thoughtful curiosity he had once directed toward beetles and wooden toy horses in a much smaller garden far to the north. "It is beautiful," Julian said honestly, "though I miss my friends in Willowmere sometimes. Mama says we will visit them often, though." Alaric smiled, genuine warmth filling his chest at his son's honest, uncomplicated perspective. "Willowmere shaped you into who you are, and I would never wish to erase that important part of your story, even as we build new memories together here at Thornfield." As months passed into a full year following Elena's return, the estate gradually settled into a new, more honest rhythm. Alaric formally announced Julian as his rightful heir before the full assembly of tenants and household staff, a ceremony conducted with considerably more transparency and community involvement than the formal, distant traditions that had characterized previous generations of Thornfield's succession. Elena stood beside Alaric during this ceremony, watching their son accept the formal recognition of his birthright, with the same thoughtful seriousness that had always characterized his approach to significant moments. And she felt, for the first time since that terrible night 5 years earlier, a genuine sense of peace settling over the complicated, difficult journey that had brought them to this point. That evening, after the formal ceremony had concluded and the gathered tenants had returned to their own homes, Elena and Alaric walked together through the same gardens where their marriage had once flourished, before pride and deception had torn it apart, Julian running ahead of them, chasing fireflies that had begun appearing with the deepening summer twilight. "We have built something stronger than what existed before," Alaric said quietly, watching their son's delighted laughter carry across the darkening garden, "not despite what we endured, but perhaps because of it." Elena considered his words carefully, reflecting on the difficult years of separation, the fear and uncertainty of those early months in Willowmere, the quiet strength she had discovered within herself through necessity, and the gradual, careful rebuilding of trust that had brought them to this peaceful evening. "Perhaps you are right," she said finally, reaching for his hand as they continued walking together through the gathering dusk. "Though I would not wish such difficult lessons upon anyone else seeking happiness within their own family." Alaric squeezed her hand gently, gratitude and love mingling in his expression, as he watched their son's carefree laughter fill the summer evening air. "No," he agreed softly, "but perhaps what matters most is not the difficulty of the path we walked, but the strength and honesty we carry forward from having walked it." They continued their quiet walk through Thornfield's gardens as evening deepened into night, Julian's delighted laughter echoing warmly around them, the estate's ancient walls witnessing not the cold cruelty that had once driven Elena away in disgrace, but the patient, hard-won reconciliation of a family that had learned, through genuine hardship and eventual honesty, the true meaning of trust freely given and courageously rebuilt. The same gates that had once closed behind Elena in humiliation and heartbreak now stood open behind them, welcoming her home not as a woman cast aside by suspicion and pride, but as the rightful Duchess of Thornfield, mother to its future heir, and partner in a marriage finally built upon the honest foundation it had always deserved.